5.
The perception of hate is what is now embedded in our police system.
4.
It's all performative nonsense, and Trump will see through it for the performative nonsense that it is.
3.
When you've got AFD taking around 40% of the working class vote, I've seen, you cannot ignore that.
2.
Twats, people who only go to work on Tuesdays, Wednesdays and Thursdays. Sorry.
1. We have liftoff.
Welcome once again to Planet Normal, the Telegraph podcast with Allison Pearson.
Hello.
And me, Liam Halligan. Allison Pearson's taking legal action against Essex police. That's the subject of your column in Wednesday's Telegraph, Allison. Link in the show notes to this episode. And this follows uniformed police officers turning up on your doorstep, of course, on Remembrance Sunday, in reference to a quickly deleted tweet you posted the previous year. And yet, since then, despite political and public outrage following your case, police forces across the country have continued to pursue these ridiculously named and even more ridiculously conceived non-crime hate incidents, despite the consistent failure to investigate, let alone solve, all kinds of genuine crimes, not least burglary. This is a big step by you co-pilots, given the angst and pain you suffered during the Remembrance Sunday episode. And this new case will involve yet more stress. We discuss why you're doing it and why your upcoming action is so important. Keir Starmer's in Washington today, Thursday, meeting his former nemesis Donald Trump. Ahead of that, Starmer's been sounding more like a Tory or even a Reform Prime Minister, pledging to raise military spending from 2.3% of GDP to 2.5% by 2027 and 2.6% the following year, paid for by cutting the foreign aid budget, we're told. Statistical smoke and mirrors, or a genuine shift in the Labour Party's thinking, as a rift opens between Trump and Western Europe over the future of Ukraine. The German electorate lurched rightward last Sunday, with the vote for Alternative for Deutschland, described by some as hard right, doubling to over 20%. Yet the centre-left SPD looks set to remain in government, albeit under the leadership of Friedrich Merz's centre-right CDU. I asked in my latest Telegraph column if Germany's leaders can rescue a now deeply stagnating economy. And then we learned earlier this week UK energy prices are going up again for firms and businesses. What of Labour's manifesto pledge to slash £300 a year off our energy bills? And meanwhile, the all-powerful and entirely unelected Climate Change Committee is telling us we all need to fly less, kill our cows and other livestock, and eat less meat. Alison, plenty to get your juices stirring there, but tell us first, given that regular Planet Normal listeners know how stressful you found that whole episode last November, why are you taking this big step now to launch a legal case against Essex police?
Yes, why am I, Liam? Why am I? There's been quite a bit of soul searching. I think the reality is that things are not changing, not just what happened to me, but what is happening to hundreds of people a week, having these Orwellian strange things inflicted on them. It's worth saying, Liam, that anyone listening now to Planet Normal, you could be tomorrow in a pub or in a supermarket or in the hairdressers, and you could say something and a random stranger could report you for hate crime, thought crime, right?
Yeah.
And the minute that they reported you to the police, they would be called the victim, which is what I was told my accuser was called, and you have no recourse. In fact, a perception of hate is what is now embedded in our police system, and to challenge the perception of hate, which I think would be a common sense reaction from most people, is deemed to be an indication of more hate.
That's Kafkaesque. There's no escape from that.
There is no escape from that. So various factors have been brought to bear, really. I've been talking to some very good lawyers, and under Article 10 of the Human Rights Act, we all have a right to freedom of expression, to hold our own opinions and to express them freely without interference. I think that my human rights were breached by Essex police, and I think many, many thousands of British people's human rights are being breached by the police across the country. And at the weekend, people may have seen the story of Helen Jones, a grandmother in the Northwest. Helen had put a couple of very, very mild posts in a closed Facebook group saying she wished that this local councillor would resign. He had been caught up in a recent scandal in which the councillor had said, you know, oh, these dreadful people, this dreadful old woman wrote to me saying she wanted her bins collected, and the MP had joked, oh, let's hope she dies before the next election. And Helen had said she really didn't like this councillor. And lo and behold, 2 plainclothes policemen turned up at her door. She wasn't in. She was round the corner babysitting her grandson. But the coppers said to her husband and later to Helen on the phone, we've just come to advise you that there's been a complaint of harassment. Now, the police don't just come round.
Yeah. And they wouldn't tell her who it was.
No, well, there was real, for me, there were real echoes. You'll remember the 2 policemen at my door on Remembrance Sunday. I asked, what's the social media post? We're not allowed to tell you that, madam. What's the name of my accuser? We're not allowed to tell you that either, madam, but it's a victim. They're almost farcical, aren't they, Liam?
Yeah.
But of course, also deeply sinister. And then I started corresponding with a fantastic guy called Harry Miller. People may have heard of him. Harry is an ex-copper who fought his own extremely successful free speech case up to the High Court and the Court of Appeal. And Harry was accused of transphobic tweets because he said he didn't think men could become women. And Harry told me that he'd been in a House of Lords committee recently where Lord Herbert, the chair of the College of Policing, said that in response to recent public confusion and concern over non-crime hate incidents, so the response, Liam, of the College of Policing to the public concern over the non-crime hate incidents was to change the name of non-crime hate incidents.
We are through the looking glass.
Have they learnt any lessons? Are they going to amend their ways? Well, Helen Jones said the officer's visit was so intimidating, she was terrified to post on social media again. And I would suggest that that is the point of these visits, as I think I was being frightened, deliberately intimidated. And I was lucky, Liam, because, you know, I had a platform, I had you and Planet Normal listeners, I had the fantastic Telegraph news team that rode in behind me. So I had a platform, and even I was really upset.
You were in a really bad way, if I may say so.
Yeah, I was. Well, I was under criminal investigation.
A lot of the rest of the media telling you were pleading victim status, and do you remember all that? Crikey.
Yeah, well, you know, the usual. We far-right hooligans don't deserve any sympathy, do we? But in fact, talking to Harry Miller, Harry said, and this really struck home, he said, my worry is that eventually someone is going to end up killing themselves following one of these knocks on the door. And he said, Harry's a really good, you know, rough, tough, strong guy. He said, I know I came very close to it myself. And I have to say, Liam, it's quite hard to say this, but I certainly had suicidal thoughts during that period when I was under criminal investigation. I was seeing my name in scores of headlines alongside words like racist and hatred. And of course, people who know me, care about me, they know who I am. But there will be other people, and there were people on social media saying absolutely dreadful things. And that rising tide of dread takes its toll. Really, my decision is motivated by the sense that I can do something. And Harry Miller said something to me, again, very striking. Those of us with the strength and mental fortitude to hold these twats to account, I love the use of twats there, have an obligation to do so.
Twats, people who only go to work on Tuesdays, Wednesdays and Thursdays. Sorry.
Yeah, well, and also not just members of the public and listeners and so on, but lots of police officers, both serving and retired. They've written urging me to take a stand on something that they feel is bringing their work into disrepute. And one officer who works, funnily enough, for Essex Police, he wrote and said, Hate is a growth industry in policing. They need higher figures to justify the diversity mission. Alison, please, we need your help to fight this nonsense.
As we said at the time, if you can just knock on the doors of people in their homes and then do a load of paperwork and chalk it up as a sort of, quotes, crime solved,
yes,
while dunking biscuits in your tea, it's a lot easier than, chasing bad guys on the streets, isn't it? Which is what we want our cops to be doing, of course.
I'll tell you what's really interesting is this College of Policing is another, we're going to come on later, aren't we, to the Climate Change Committee, but we seem to have these very, very powerful quangos. I learnt today, Liam, that the College of Policing employs 600 people. How many of us, hands up, anybody who'd like to see some of those 600 police employees out on the streets actually trying to protect people? But anyway, there they are, and they have this extraordinary influence, and College of Policing has brought us marvellous things like Believe Every Victim. And it struck me that particularly with these hate crimes, to me, they feel incredibly un-British. We have the presumption of innocence, that these completely overturn fundamental freedoms which have defined our civilization, made our country the beacon of fairness and decency that it has been. And I think the other thing, which I think listeners might be quite interested, is that every time one of these cases like mine has made it to the High Court and to the Court of Appeal, time and again, the most senior judges in the land have said free speech must be the paramount concern. Absolutely, there has to be freedom only to speak inoffensively is not worth having. I would say the tweet for which I was dragged over the coals was comparatively innocuous compared to much of the stuff that's posted. I don't apologise for it at all. I'm entitled to offend people. I don't care. I'm offended and I don't call the police. I live in a society where I think people who call the police because they're offended are just pathetic. And yet one of the judges actually said in the Harry Miller judgment, he said that what the police had done was give the complainant a heckler's veto. Do we want to live in a society where random people, because they've got hurt feelings, are given a heckler's veto? I don't want to live in that society. I don't think Planet Normal listeners want to. And if this action can even mildly chastise these people, make them think again next time, okay, so we've just had this difficult legal action. Maybe it would be very good to go and knock on Mr. Halligan's door or whatever.
Steady.
It's worth trying, Liam, isn't it?
Yeah. And more power to your elbow. I know it's going to be tough for you, and Planet Normal listeners who've been with us for a while will recall just how distressed you were at the back end of last year in the aftermath of that visit from Essex Police to you. And I do think it will, just like your case was literally reported around the world.
Yes.
I do think it will happen again, and it may cause other constabularies around the country to stop and think, and it may actually even cause our politicians to have a word with the boys in blue. Not the rank and file, because I think a lot of rank and file policemen and women know this is nuts. Certainly lots of them that I've spoken to that have contacted us here at Planet Normal. It seems to be a kind of wokerati at the top of the police who are chasing performance targets to which their own personal pay may well be linked. And it's a lot easier to fill in these boxes and put the frighteners on slightly bullshit people who are axiomatic to the health of our democracy. Because free speech without freedom to offend isn't worth having. Without the freedom to say things that make certain people uncomfortable isn't worth having. Not because you want to make them uncomfortable, but because sometimes hard truths need to be aired. So good luck to you, Alison.
I'm quite intrigued, Liam, about whether, because today Planet Normal is going out on Thursday and the Prime Minister will be in the Oval Office with President Trump. And I wonder whether Trump might raise the issue of the problem of free speech in the UK, because remember, we saw that very striking J.D. Vance speech at the Munich Security Conference. And since then, Vance has doubled down, basically saying if these European countries no longer share our common values of liberty, democracy, freedom of speech, essentially there was a coded threat there. So let's just see. I think our Keir could have a bit of a bumpy ride with Donald. What do you think?
I think that will happen, not least because the Prime Minister and a lot of his front bench have previously chastised Trump in no uncertain terms, and the US President is likely to have a bit of fun with that, if only to diffuse that embarrassment and that awkwardness. I think he's classy enough to do that. Indeed, he's already tried to do that. He's called Starmer a nice guy a few times. I think he's been a lot friendlier to the Prime Minister than the Prime Minister has been to him so far, at least. Anyway, we'll see what happens on the tariffs. And I talked to American relatives, American friends, fellow American journalists, and they're absolutely outraged that the UK, the home of free speech, is doing this stuff with these non-crime hate incidents. It's absolutely mad. More generally, of course, Starmer is trying to up the ante when it comes to defence spending. These are minuscule increases. And of course, all the numbers are complete nonsense because all the numbers are as percentages of GDP. And GDP, of course, will be driven by growth numbers. And the government's still using growth numbers that are already woefully out of date because the Bank of England has halved its growth numbers, its forecasts for this year so far. And the OBR, the Office of Budget Responsibility, the official forecaster, the numbers that the government will use, has yet to do that. So before the OBR lowers its growth numbers, but after the Bank of England has lowered its growth numbers, you can talk about any numbers you want as a percentage of GDP, and they're total nonsense. So we're talking about tenths of 1 percentage point increases as if it's some great shift, Britain gearing up for a new world order. I mean, I'm no warmonger. On the contrary, I want us to have a robust, professional army and navy and air force. The men and women in that, for the most part, do a fantastic job, and I'm grateful to them. But this is hardly Britain rearming, is it? A tenth of 1% increase in our spending as a share of GDP that will turn out to be a smaller GDP than the government's currently forecasting, because the growth numbers at the moment forecast are overestimates of what the outcome is likely to be. It's all performative nonsense, and Trump will see through it for the performative nonsense that it is. The real choice that Starmer has to make, and it's a very tough choice, is whether or not he is prepared to get with the program that Trump is basically going to impose on the Western world, that America wants this war in Ukraine to be over. America wants to come to some kind of settlement with Russia so Trump can focus on China. The real danger, the real geopolitical danger in the world, in my view, isn't a flare-up in the aftermath of Putin's illegal invasion of Ukraine. I think that will be, while Europeans and British politicians will huff and puff, I do think that situation, for the most part, thankfully will calm down. Over 1 million people have died in that war, soldiers on both sides and indeed civilians. The real danger in the world is that Trump's tariffs, his facing down of China on tariffs, results in China and Xi wanting to prove that they are not going to be pushed around, and that China then retaliate, not just in more tariffs, and then you'd have an escalation between the two biggest economies in the world, which would seriously undermine the trajectory of the global economy. But you have Xi trying to assert himself, whisper it, and I hate to say this, when it comes to Taiwan, giving the not just the symbolic significance to the Chinese of Taiwan, which they consider to be part of the Chinese mainland. Of course, I think that's an outrageous historic claim, but that's what they think. But also Taiwan as, the center of global semiconductor manufacturing, by the way, semiconductors now being almost as important as oil and gas when it comes to fueling global growth. That is my concern. That is what Starmer and Trump should be talking about and focusing on, rather than, I think, Starmer grandstanding to try and carve out some slightly different position from Trump on Russia, Ukraine.
Yeah, I think that's right. And I think this really is a fig leaf, or if not a cricket box, for Starmer to wear into the Oval Office when
A
Donald
cricket box is a sort of galvanised fig leaf, isn't it?
galvanised fig leaf, exactly.
It goes sort of fig leaf. Can I say merkin? Can I say?
Oh no, you
cricket
can't say
box?
merkin.
Not
no.
Planet North, family
I think
show,
that-
old boy.
I think that's one for the ladies. But yeah, so he's going to be wearing this reinforced fig leaf.
I'm just trying to show, diversity in my loin adornment references. Okay.
Yeah, we're very gender neutral
Yeah,
here,
yeah.
aren't we?
Gender aware, darling.
Oh, gender aware, yeah, gender aware. But you have to say, Liam, underpinning this, quite a disgraceful story. I've been talking over the past few months to some very senior former military people, and they paint such a dire picture. The British Armed Forces have been hollowed out.
Yeah.
To such a calamitous extent that even if this was 13 billion extra, which be lucky if it's half that, it would barely scratch the surface of the deficiencies in equipment, manpower, communications. My partner was raised in a military family. I have huge affection and respect. They're some of our best people, Liam. They're loyal, patriotic, hardworking. They've actually been given such a raw deal.
The accommodation a lot of army families now have to, not just with huge respect, the so-called rank and file, literally the rank and file, but the officer class too. Some of the accommodation they're living in is disgraceful.
Well, listeners will remember us campaigning on the officers' wives came on, were talking to us about losing their already quite modest. They're not living in sort of Knightsbridge apartments,
No.
are they? They were just being downgraded to small numbers of bedrooms the minute one of the children went off to university. But, here we are. I'd like to ask listeners, what do you imagine would have happened if a Conservative government had dared to slash that much from the foreign aid budget? Laura Kuenssberg would have imploded, wouldn't she, with horror? But the Labour government's given a free pass. But it seems to me that, as you say, it's nonsense. We are currently wasting billions surrendering the Chagos Islands. In fact, the Chagos Islands billions may be part of the smoke and mirrors around this defence budget increase. We're blowing eye-watering sums on net zero to no great avail. And yet, as the American security umbrella is removed, we leave our own country precarious and exposed to some very serious forces. And I thought Starmer's grandstanding, here I am making a historic declaration. Honestly, I didn't think I could feel more contempt for that man, but he's testing my patience, co-pilot.
It's worth saying that the lowering of the foreign aid budget, or the slowdown in the rate of increase of the foreign aid budget, however it comes out in the wash, will in theory take money away from the use of hotels for asylum seekers, so-called asylum seekers. Some of them may be asylum seekers, we don't know. A lot of them will just be straightforward economic migrants. That's just a fact, because the foreign aid budget is being used for that. So if you don't have a slowdown in the number of people arriving illegally here in the UK, that will cut even more deeply into the legitimate aspects of foreign aid. And I think the foreign aid budget over the many years has become bloated. A lot of it is about admin and nice junkets for professional people, but actual emergency relief in very marginal parts of the world, I do think the UK has a responsibility to spend at least some money on those kind of things. And it may be that really, in my view, legitimate foreign aid that gets cut. I think when it comes to Trump as well, Starmer would be very well advised to distance himself from what's going on in Germany, distance himself from this debate, in order to try and ingratiate himself with the SPD, the sort of soft centre-left party that's just been chucked out of office after an incredibly lacklustre 4 years from Olaf Scholz. The new German Chancellor, Friedrich Merz, who, of course, is the CDU, Merkel's party. He's in theory to the right of Merkel. He doesn't get on with Merkel. She shut him out of CDU politics for many, many years. There's no love lost between them. During the election, he was saying, things that sounded pretty substantial on the centre right, because he was trying to face down AfD, right? He was trying to face them down. And yet he's now saying, we can form a coalition with the SPD. He literally said we can rush it through in 2 months to just form a government. It's absolutely insane. AFD's vote share has doubled, right, in 4 years from 10% to 20%. They are polling very heavily among younger voters. They are scoring big numbers, not just in East Germany, their stronghold, but also in West Germany as well. And you're going to get the SPD staying in government, albeit as the junior partner. And in order to form this coalition, Merz is already making massive concessions when the German public has voted very clearly for more border controls, the border controls that Merz said he would introduce. He's now saying within hours of Sunday's election, in order to try and get the SPD into government, oh, no one's talking about border controls of any kind. Oh, as if we wouldn't do that. If he keeps doing this, you're going to get another German election. I would not rule that out. It may be that they just can't form a coalition. The German political class has such a nervous breakdown on the domestic front, they can't form a coalition. And I think Starmer has to distance himself, not just from that kind of complete head in the sand kind of response to domestic electorate. He also has to distance himself from this increasingly strident rhetoric from Merz, who's very much a kind of Atlanticist guy. I mean, he has been his whole political career. But in order to try and ingratiate himself with some of the German loony left, with all respect, he may yet need the Greens. He's coming out with really strident anti-Atlanticist rhetoric. Oh, it's Europe alone now. America is our enemy. You know, you had that idiot in Germany crying his eyes out because of Vance's speech. I mean, what kind of leaders do we have? You don't expect this of a German football team, and you don't expect it of German politicians. They should be hard, flinty, realistic, professional people.
Merz was even saying maybe NATO won't even exist by April. I thought that really is a sort of counsel of despair, isn't it?
That's student politics. This is not a time for student politics, and Starmer needs to distance himself from this kind of student politics.
But as you say, Liam, the Germans voted overwhelmingly for a right-wing prospectus. That's what they're expecting. And the fact that they voted hugely against the SPD, didn't they?
They got their 16% of the SPD. This is Schröder's party. This is the SPD's worst result in their history.
Absolutely whacked by the electorate. And then, as you say, under this extraordinary sort of coalition system, that this disgraced and rejected party could come to be having the veto over the very policies that the majority of Germans would actually like, which, given the spate of Islamist attacks that we saw in the run-up to the elections and the growing sense that over 1 million Syrians may have to go home because such is the sort of social unrest and so on. I don't see Starmer distancing himself from these people. He is those people.
Yeah, he is those people. They're his friends.
Those are his instincts, aren't
Yeah,
they?
absolutely. Look, we're going to come on to the energy price cap after we've listened to our Planet Normal guest. But I just want to say one final thing before we move on, Alison, if I may, about Germany. And it's something that I wrote in my Sunday Telegraph column. And it did cause quite a lot of controversy, but it was very well sourced, if I may say so. So what's happening is that there is increasing concern about European debt markets. It sounds arcane, but listeners will remember the 2011-2012 Eurozone crisis, which wasn't like the global financial crisis, but it caused enormous financial instability for a number of years across the whole of Western Europe, including the UK. We're not talking about Greece needing a bailout now. There are increasing rumours that France is going to need a bailout. France with debt of 120% of GDP, very slow growth, very low productivity and so on. And of course, if there is a French bailout, it will be the Germans and the other North European economies, but particularly the Germans who pay. The danger is now that there is a bailout of France of some kind, but the European authorities are seen to have kept it secret from the German electorate in the run-up to this election. A German electorate, of course, who has been at the receiving end of much more austere, prudent, fiscally responsible policies by the Germans. The Germans have lowered their debt as a share of GDP from 90-odd% to 60-odd% over recent years, whereas the French has gone completely in the other direction. So that will be the ultimate recruiting sergeant for AfD. I'd say if the Germans carry on as they are, not forming a coalition, thinking they can just stick their head in the sand, steady as she goes. If Germany continues to stagnate, as I pointed out, we're now in the third successive year of economic contraction in Germany. It's quite astonishing, given that Germany was such an economic powerhouse just a few years ago, but a combination of some really mad policies on energy provision and net zero and overexposure to Chinese markets, a lack of innovation, a lack of digitization on the behalf of their business and financial class. If they keep their head in the sand, if the economy stagnates, if you end up with some kind of Eurozone crisis with the German population paying again, then AfD, and this gives me no pleasure to say this, will be odds on to win Germany's next federal election, scheduled for 2029, but it could come earlier than that. Now on to our Planet Normal guest, and we're delighted to welcome back onto the rocket Ross Clark, one of the UK's most respected journalists. A prolific contributor to The Spectator, The Mail and The Sun, Ross's writing is both highly analytical and eminently accessible. He's very good at explaining complex ideas, particularly policy ideas, to a broad audience. Ross last appeared on Planet Normal in February 2023 to mark the publication of his book, Not Zero: How an Irrational Target Will Impoverish You, Help China, and Won't Even Save the Planet. And his latest book is Far From Eutopia: How Europe's Falling Behind and Britain Could Do Better. That's just been published by Abacus. A Cambridge-educated grammar school boy, Ross has also published How to Label a Goat, the silly rules and regulations that are strangling Britain, plus several plays and musicals, as well as The Denial, a satirical novel about climate change. Ross Clark, welcome back to Planet Normal.
Thank you.
So you're a writing machine. You've written another book, Far From Eutopia, Eutopia. Why did you write this book, Ross? I remember talking to you in the run-up to the referendum, and I seem to recall you voted Remain.
I did vote Remain. I was about 50-50 in my case. I think I was probably the only person in the country felt like the only person in the country who thought there were good arguments on both sides. But I came down on the Remain side, really partly because I'm too pathetic to stray outside the comfort zone, if you like, and I could see it be very disruptive. But I was, at the same time, I was very enthused by the idea of, becoming a sort of Singapore on Thames, ripping up the rules and becoming far more business-friendly, pro-growth country. I just couldn't quite imagine it happening, and I think everything that's happened since probably reinforces that. But I think what really encouraged me to write the book was I was just fed up. I was appalled by the way the rearguard Remain lobby behaved after the referendum in coming up with all these sort of spurious predictions and claims that the UK economy had been destroyed by Brexit, and
while trying to reverse the vote, of course, let us not forget.
Yes, exactly, trying to reverse the vote and undermine democracy while trying to stand for it. But yeah, I wanted to look far more what was going on across the channel, and the more you do that, the more you realise where Britain sort of is very much on the skids. We got zero economic growth, zero productivity growth. Things are so much similar across the channel. The whole of Europe is trapped in this sort of social democratic model of high public spending, high deficits, high and low growth, and excessive regulation damaging growth. And Brexit has given us the opportunity to escape from that low trajectory, but we haven't taken it so far. And in the book, I really examine that side of things. What could we be doing which we aren't doing in order to boost growth?
I share your frustration, Ross. Like you, I saw good arguments on both sides of the referendum debate back in 2016. Like you, I was absolutely appalled, as were many of my friends who voted Remain, by the way, like you, when a lot of the political media establishment tried to reverse the vote before it had even been implemented. And like you, I'm bewildered that the UK hasn't taken advantage of Brexit freedoms. I wrote a book back in the day with the economist Gerard Lyons, Clean Brexit, about how we could take advantage of those opportunities. And I think you've very much taken that debate on in Far From Eutopia. It's not an anti-European rant at all. It's a very measured and highly analytical but very readable book about what the UK could be doing in order to improve its lot. Why do you think it is, Ross? You're mainly an economics and analytical writer, but I know you follow politics closely too. Why do you think it is that the UK has been so cautious in terms of taking advantage of these Brexit freedoms?
I think the will wasn't really there beforehand. And of course, those people who voted leave and who wanted to create the sort of Singapore on Thames idea, use the new freedoms to create a much more neoliberal economy, if you like. I think they were quite a small subset of the people who voted to leave overall. And of course, the government of the day, even though it's the Leave campaign's slogan had been take back control, it was about sovereignty. Once the referendum was passed, we got this sort of idea built up that Britons had only voted leave in order to cut migration. But then what happened? Of course, COVID ruined the chance of the Boris Johnson's government taking advantage of Brexit. And we can never know how things would have progressed had it not been for this virus completely dominating his premiership.
And our response to the virus,
well,
more accurate.
the virus and our response to the virus completely took out 2 years from the British political scene, really. It dominated everything right from a month after Brexit.
What do you want to see happen, Ross, that hasn't happened? Obviously, we've cut a few trade deals, which a lot of the Remainers said we couldn't do. We've joined the CPTPP, the big Pacific Basin trade deal, which I personally think could be a huge boon to the UK going forward. I want to come on to electric vehicles and net zero, because that's a particular area where our rules are currently, as you've pointed out, more stringent than the European Union's rules. But apart from that, what other aspects do you outline in the book that you think the UK could take advantage of that we're not taking advantage of?
No, there's, just to add to the list of things we have done, one or two things like on gene editing. The EU completely finished off genetically modified foods 25 years ago when we had quite a good lead on it in Britain. We're maybe not going to repeat that because the government has freed up rules on gene editing to allow that to happen. But that's the good bit. What more could we be doing? Just look at what the energy which the Trump administration has laid into the DEI stuff. And there's whole layers of that kind of regulation, which not only have we not repealed, but we've actually built on. We've decided we should have more stringent rules on in the workplace. And you look at the sort of legislation Labour wants to put through now on the right to flexible working, right to 3-day week and so on. Just look at some of the ways in which the US, which, by the way, has been growing about 0.5% per year faster than Europe economy. And while that doesn't sound a lot year on year, it creates a very big difference. If you want to rationalise your business in America, you just do it. You close down one factory, open up something elsewhere and so on. There are very few rules. The rules are very business friendly there. You try and do it in France, you've got to ask the Workers' Council. You try and do it in the Netherlands. Similarly, you've got to take into account flexible working and all this sort of thing. It is so much more difficult to rationalise a business. And that's why we have Europe tends to treat its industries as a sort of form of heritage. They're things which have to be preserved. Whereas in the US and Singapore, which I write about quite a lot in the book, there's much more an attitude. No, we've done that. Now let business move on to the next thing, the thing which we are going to have the best comparative advantage in, new technology. Europe over and over again has shown itself to be frightened of new technology, and it's happening again with AI, just as it happened with GM food and so on. And if you're always trying to preserve the jobs you have, preserve the factories you already have, you're not going to move forward. You're not going to grow your economy. You're just holding up existing industrial infrastructure to be gradually undermined by foreign competition. And that's what is so different in Europe.
What are your thoughts, Ross, in the aftermath of the weekend's federal elections in Germany? AfD, of course, have doubled their vote, 20%, and yet German voters are going to get more of the SPD, probably in coalition with the CDU under Friedrich Merz, of course, CDU, formerly Angela Merkel's party. To what extent do you think what's going on in Germany really illustrates the central thrust of your book, Far From Eutopia?
Yeah, and this goes back to days after the Second World War, really, when there's a fundamental difference in the European attitude to democracy as opposed to, say, the US attitude to democracy. And I recommend going and reading the UN Universal Declaration of Human Rights. It's written in 1948, and compare it with the European Convention on Human Rights, which was written 2 years later. And in the UN document, it's got this wonderful little phrase, very simple to understand: the basis of government shall be the will of the people. And you look through the European document, that appears nowhere. And instead, it's full of provisions of how to protect the people against themselves. And this is what we are seeing. At the time, you can perhaps understand why democracy had a bit of a bad name in Germany. People thought, oh, people voted for the Nazis and therefore we can't trust the people ever again. We've got to build this permanent infrastructure of rights to prevent any future
and keep
Nazi
the elites
party
in charge.
Yeah, and we've seen, this is exactly what we see now happening with this German election. They're going to make the established parties going to make the same mistake they've been making for decades, which is to ignore the people and to try and stitch up power between themselves. And when you've got AfD taking around 40% of the working class vote, I've seen. You can't.
Germany-wide, not just in Eastern.
Yeah, no, Germany-wide.
And lots of support among younger people.
You cannot ignore what those people were trying to say, which is that the economic and social model they feel is failing. It's not enriching them. There's too much migration and so on. And we're going to have these sort of high-minded established parties are once again going to say, no, you're all a bunch of fascists and therefore we're not going to let you in government. We're going to carry on just the way we've been going for decades. And it's just going to encourage the AfD, isn't it?
I personally think that the SPD, centre-left party, CDU, centre-right party coalition won't work. They're talking about, we could rush through a coalition deal in 2 months. My God, already Merz is making massive concessions going against his campaign promises on immigration in order to try and bring the SPD into that coalition. I personally think it's going to break up. There could easily be another election in Germany. That's my prediction. But anyway, we've got this 7th carbon budget being published today, Wednesday, Ross, the day before Planet Normal goes to air. You've also written another really analytical, very readable, but penetrating book that we've talked about before on Planet Normal, Not Zero. And you've been particularly vocal in recent months, and as have I, very much in your wake, on electric vehicles, haven't you? What are your thoughts on that debate at the moment? Is there signs that the political media class is finally getting it, that we're actually destroying our car industry in this country, which employs upwards of 1 million people?
This, of course, is another big difference between Europe and America. You look at America, Donald Trump, drill, baby, drill, and even under Joe Biden, it was pretty clear that the US was expanding oil and gas production, trying to achieve energy security, whereas Europe is loading itself with these very stringent net zero targets which haven't been thought through, and they're legally binding targets. So if you fail to achieve them, activists can and will take you to court. And it's imposing a very serious load on our industry. We've lost our primary steel industry. Jim Ratcliffe the other week was warning that we're going to lose our remaining chemical industry.
The guy who owns INEOS, of course, our massive chemical company.
Yeah. There's closing down the oil refinery at Grangemouth, for example. And this is all totally unnecessary burdens. There is no point in Europe pursuing this net zero targets if the rest of the world is not playing ball. Europe carbon emissions are around sort of 10% of the total. We're not going to save the planet on our own, but what we are going to do is to destroy our industry, offshore industry. We've got created this very perverse incentive because all the targets that we have are just territorial ones. They're carbon emissions physically spewed out in Britain, physically spewed out in Germany and so on. We don't count the emissions embedded in products which are made in, say, in China and imported to Europe. So it gives governments this perverse incentive to close down their own industries and import stuff as well. So, you've offshored your carbon emissions, you've offshored your jobs and your wealth as well. But in terms of achieving the target, of course, it helps you achieve that. But electric cars are a very interesting case because the European car industry has been subject to these targets, proposed bans on petrol and diesel cars, and there's a case where Britain has a more stringent target than the EU. Labour wants to do it by 2030. The EU is prepared to allow petrol and diesel cars to be made up to 2035. But in spite of having these targets, the European car industry is failing. And you think, well, weren't these targets supposed to allow Britain and the rest of Europe to get ahead? We're always told we can't be left behind. The reason we need these targets is that they will enrich us, they will encourage green industries. They have to encourage green industries, but in China rather than Europe, because of course
China's 65% of all EVs made in the world now, not least because they dominate battery production, because they dominate the production of the rare earths that you need in those, and processing of the rare earths that you need in those batteries.
They've been much cleverer at cornering the market in the metals that are required for the batteries, but also, of course, they're much cheaper energy prices. And why do they have?
And you've been very effective, Ross, if I may say so, explaining to the sort of broader media class, even if the political class seems incapable of getting it into its head, that the EU's rules in terms of the upcoming ban on petrol and diesel cars are actually less stringent than our rules. Even though we've left the EU, our rules are even tougher, even though we both have a headline ban by 2035, which of course Labour may or may not bring forward to 2030.
Exactly, and also on the electricity. Ed Miliband trying to decarbonise our electricity grid by 2030, which is causing all sorts of problems and going to cost consumers billions of pounds. The rest of Europe isn't quite as mad at pursuing those targets as we are here. So you think, well, why did we left the EU in order to take back control, but we've used that control in order to actually lumber our industry and our consumers with extra burdens compared with the EU, which doesn't really make a lot of sense.
Finally, Ross, you are good on the detail of this in my experience. How possible is it, or how impossible is it, to, quote, decarbonise our electricity grid by 2030?
Well, extremely difficult, and virtually nobody outside Ed Miliband and his quango he set up to manage the national grid thinks it's possible. What you have to do, it's not just a case of building wind turbines and solar farms, which we're doing merrily, because, of course, you can't do it without solving the intermittency problem.
And he's saying no natural gas by 2030, right? And natural gas is like 40% of our electricity.
Well, yes, he was saying no natural gas by 2030, but he's subtly changed now, and his plan is now to back up wind and solar farms with gas, which is, what we do now. But he thinks we'll have, he's 100% net zero target for electricity grid by 2030, that's actually come down to a 95% target, and the remaining 5% he foresees as being unabated gas.
But you know how expensive it is to have natural gas on standby just to be fired up on certain days. It sends the unit cost of all electricity to the moon.
Exactly. What we end up having to do is we're going to have two parallel electricity systems, one for windy and sunny days and one for cloudy and windless days. And as you say, the unit cost of gas production, generating electricity from gas, if you're doing it in an intermittent way, is very much higher. And thanks to our electricity market, we have this thing called marginal cost pricing, where the cost of all electricity is determined by the most expensive form of electricity, which is generating at any one time. So, wind and solar might be theoretically cheaper at the marginal cost, but the price is set by the cost of this intermittent gas price, which is huge. And I liken it, it's like going to the supermarket and say, I'm going to throw a party and I'm going to buy 12 bottles of Prosecco, and you get to the supermarket and they've only got 11 bottles of Prosecco. So you say, okay, I'll have to buy 11 bottles of that and I'll make it up with one bottle of Veuve Clicquot. And then you go to the checkout and they charge you for 12 bottles of Veuve Clicquot. That's how the sort of electricity system works, and why it is so expensive, why consumer prices are so expensive in Britain. We have the highest domestic and industrial electricity prices of any country that is a member of the International Energy Agency. And this is in a country which has embraced wind and solar energy more than any other major country. We generate a higher proportion of our electricity from those forms than any other major developed nation, and yet we have the highest prices. So, something's not working there, is it? And, Ed Miliband's promise of saving us all £300 a year on our energy bills by switching to wind and solar is looking one of the biggest political millstones in history, to go with his headstone, I suppose.
Brilliant, Ross, and a wonderful champagne-driven analogy to end, as we expect from Spectator journalists. Great to have you on Planet Normal.
Thank you, Liam.
There you go, Alison. Ross Clark, his latest book, Far from Eutopia, How Europe's Failing and Britain Could Do Better, recently published by Abacus.
Ross has been extremely good, as you say, Liam. I mean, I really admire him enormously, always learn so much from reading his articles. I mean, he's bang on this week talking about the energy price cap rise, which you mentioned at the top, 6.4%. Do you know what? It's been a while since we've had a Velma stat. What say you, co-pilot?
Oh, Shaggy, Scooby-Doo. I thought you'd forgotten about Velma.
No.
You've been missing the spray-on white boots, haven't you?
No, that's Daphne. Velma's the one with the clumpy clogs. I'm the plain one, remember? You're the glamorous Fred with the cravat. Yeah, so Velma stat. Renewable energy, this is on the back of Ed Miliband claiming ludicrously that the rise in energy bills as a result of the global spike in gas prices will be worrying news for families, says our Secretary of State for Net Zero and Energy Security. As long as we remain exposed to fossil fuel markets, we'll be stuck on the roller coaster of prices. What a fibber. So here's the Velma stat. Renewable energy has increased fivefold between 2010 and 2024. Consumer electricity bills have increased in that time by 144%. The average annual dual fuel energy bill, we know about that at Pearson Towers, now includes around £150 for Ed Miliband's green taxes. No one voted for that, Liam. In fact, people voted for a Labour Party whose then leader said, we will cut £300 off your energy bills. Now, that doesn't look like that's going to be happening anytime soon. Something Ross Clark has written about very well in The Spectator is this climate change committee, which has produced its 7th carbon budget. Now, Lord Frost, David Frost, a great friend of the Planet Normal, calls the climate change committee Britain's real government. I have to say, Liam, that having spoken to former Conservative cabinet ministers, the Climate Change Committee isn't democratically elected. It's full of eco-nuts, but it has the power to terrorise cabinet ministers who do its bidding. And this latest carbon budget, even by their imaginative standards, is a work of experimental fiction. So the Climate Change Committee is saying there's going to be an increase in annual spending on net zero from around 16 billion today to, wait for it, 40 billion or more in 2029. And we'll be sustaining that level of expenditure for a decade. And the thing that jumps out at me, Liam, from this carbon budget is Starmer and Miliband keep telling us that net zero can be delivered without affecting our lifestyles. But that's not what the Climate Change Committee is saying. Nearly 40% of carbon reductions will come from household and lifestyle changes. We're all going to be switching to electric vehicles not many people want to buy. We're going to be switching to heat pumps that even fewer people want to buy. You're going to love this. There's going to be a reduction in average meat and dairy consumption. Not when you're on Manjaro, there isn't. I can tell you. My average meat consumption, I basically live by steak alone.
You've gone from rabbit to hunter-gatherer. Me, Tarzan, you, Jane.
Chew on raw steaks. But yeah, just to sum up, coming back to the point I was making to you earlier, what we're seeing is this committee driving us ever faster onwards to the cliff edge, as far as I'm concerned. And in the real world, Liam, it's not biting, is it? Ross Clark also mentioned this week that BP is, guess what, ditching renewables.
They're certainly winding down their renewables. They had a renewable target of 40% of their output by 2030, and it went down to 25%, and now it's much lower than that. Look, according to the Climate Change Committee, we've already cut our emissions by half since 1990, which makes us pretty much the most gung-ho advanced economy in the world in terms of cutting emissions. The Climate Change Committee thinks that half of all cars are going to be EVs by 2040. I just don't see that. I think electric vehicles, as I've said for many years, are a blind alley. I think it's the wrong technology. I'm not saying that we shouldn't move away from oil and gas, but EVs are not the right technology. It makes no sense in physics to have cars where the battery is a third of the weight of the car. It's just madness. And of course, the batteries rely on rare earths, of which China has the whip hand in terms of production and supply. The Climate Change Committee says the costs of moving to net zero are going to be outweighed by gains, but only by 2040. Really? What's going to happen between now and then? And bills will be significantly cheaper, says the Climate Change Committee in its fine print, by 2050. That's just not going to wash unless this net zero stuff starts to produce tangible, credible improvements in the lives of ordinary people. Unless the costs, the massive costs of the transition to net zero are distributed in a way that doesn't penalise most of all ordinary working people, particularly those working in manufacturing or people simply trying to heat their homes and keep a roof over the head of themselves and their family. It just isn't going to wash. I personally think the Tories should take a leaf out of Reform's book and be speaking much more stridently about this stuff than they currently are. And it strikes me that Ross Clark is one of the few journalists who is coherently analysing the reality of economic policy in this area. One of the few journalists in the mainstream who is doing so. And again, I think the general public on this is way ahead of most of the political and media class. People want a cleaner world for themselves and their kids and their grandkids. People want less pollution, but we can't impoverish our population on the route to getting that, particularly when we account for such a small share of carbon emissions on a global scale, and particularly when we're so far ahead of almost all the rest of the world when it comes to having lowered those emissions. And as for, ending drilling for oil and gas in the North Sea, that's completely insane, as we've often pointed out, because relying on imported gas, particularly liquefied natural gas in ships coming from America, which is what we've done, involves far, far more carbon emissions and is much, much more expensive for us as an economy than drilling our own oil and gas. I do think Ed Miliband's guilty of the most performative nonsense, and it can't be long, surely, before Starmer has to rein him in.
It seems to me, Liam, it comes from the same school of batshit crazy as the you can't point out hate for fear of being accused of hatred. I can hardly describe it really. It's just absolutely bonkers kind of thinking. And something I wanted to ask you as our second best economist on the rocket.
I think we're unanimous in that, as Mrs. Slocum almost said.
But if the price cap, right, the energy price cap is rising by 6.4% in April, Liam Halligan, does it increase the chance that inflation will go over 4%?
Of course it does. Look, the Bank of England already said months ago inflation was going to be 3.7% by this autumn. And since then, we've had a lot more inflation than the Bank of England thought would happen when they made that forecast. I think a lot of it depends on the geopolitics, stupid, as they say. It also depends on Trump and his tariffs. I think Trump's tariffs are going to be really inflationary. I think they're going to push up prices of inputs around the world. So I do think there's quite a lot of inflation coming, unfortunately. And that, of course, will be reflected in energy prices. In general, I think that the government's approach to net zero remains pie in the sky. I think unless they start to have a more realistic attitude to these policies, there's broad support for a broad shift away from dirty technologies and industries. That support is there. But unless they start to make that shift in a more measured and more responsible way, don't be surprised if the entire political consensus about this stuff collapses and we go completely in the opposite direction.
Now on to our listener emails. The messages you send to planetnormal@telegraph.co.uk. Please keep them coming. We do learn a huge amount from you and got some fantastic ones this week, including for co-pilot Pearson in her crazy bid to wrestle the constabulary into sanity. Coming back, Liam, to what's happening with the economy that we were just talking about, and that then feeds into, we've had a number of emails on the topic, on the hot topic of leaving the UK. Where are we going to go to get away from the mad island? Andrew says, I'm 50 and most of my friends are at least talking about leaving. I really don't think Labour or even the Tories who put us on this path realise they are playing with fire here. Once you reach a tipping point and the critical mass of mobile higher rate taxpayers and net contributors think, what's the point? We're off. You are done. The trick is to find a destination country that balances tax efficiency with decent weather, an attractive society, and which is not committing self-loathing, slow cultural suicide like the UK, which does, of course, rule out several countries in Europe. You also have to think about the long-term trajectory of a destination country if you're literally moving your family and geographical destiny. I was talking with my 17-year-old son about it the other day. Uni might be the right opportunity to completely change his future by going to the US, for example. How sad, says Andrew. Aaron pops up and says, try Texas. It's where I'm headed. Good salaries, low taxes, and definitely better weather. And Fran says, hi, Alison and Nim. First things first, thank you for Planet Normal. Once the COVID insanity subsided, I wondered if the rocket of right thinking might be grounded. God forbid, Fran. I'm so glad it wasn't. I actually think it's needed more than ever in these mad times. Alison recently mentioned that she has given a passing thought to the idea of leaving these shores. Alison, you're not alone. I'm nearing 63, and like many people, I started out on the leftish wing of politics and have migrated rightwards as I've grown up. I'm really in despair about the direction this country is heading. I love England, I love the UK, I love our history, our culture, our countryside, and I never ever thought that I would want to leave. I know every generation sees their past through rose-tinted spectacles, but I can't help but feel that this time it really is true. We are going to hell in a handcart, says Fran. The country I grew up in, the country that I adore, is vanishing before my eyes. So yes, I have started to think the unthinkable. At my age, it's a little harder to find a safe haven for me, my dogs, and my pension overseas. Portugal or Montenegro seem possible, but I need to do a bit more research first. I'd love it if you both return to this subject, either on the podcast or in the paper. Once again, thanks for keeping this old girl sane and giving her a belated grounding in economics. Me too, Fran. Where are we going, Hallie? Well, I don't know. We're all right in the rocket.
Re-entry can be painful, as they say.
Very painful, yeah, it can.
Now, last week we were debating you and me and you and I and all that stuff.
We were.
And Julian weighs in. Dear pilots, the rule's simple. If in doubt, construct the sentence without the other subject. E.g., I had my photo taken, then add the other subject, always placing the other subject first out of politeness. You and I had our photo taken. You would never say me and I had my photo taken, so you would never say you and me had our photo taken. Clear? Also, says Julian, not sure if you're offenders or not, but many journalists are, never use amount if you can count the object. E.g., never say the amount of people, always say the number of people, because people can be counted, i.e. the number of people. You can't count sand, so you would say the amount of sand. You could count grains of sand, however, so you say the number of grains of sand, that's fine. The same applies to less and fewer. Use less for things you can't count, like sand, and fewer for things that you can count, like people. Simple, says Julian. Good email there from Julian. And this is a wonderful email from Ian, who Alison and I were lucky enough to meet at the Free Speech Union 5th anniversary.
We love it.
Congratulations to Toby Young and his team for the establishment of the Free Speech Union, now in its 5th year. And as well as being a celebration of the Free Speech Union, we like to think that that evening was also a celebration of Planet Normal, because so many people came up to us expressing appreciation for the podcast. Dear Alison and Liam, says Ian, who we met the other night. Every Friday evening, after a busy week at work, I get home, run a hot bath, pour myself a large whiskey and tell my wife, I'm getting in the bath with Alison and Liam. She was puzzled at first. You'll not fit the three of you in that tub, she said. Well, after having had the great pleasure of meeting you both at the Free Speech Union's 5th anniversary bash, I was able to report back to her that it might be a tight squeeze, but yes, we probably could fit all three of us in. Those slimming pills are certainly doing the job. I picked up my Friday bath time habit back in 2020 when the Rocket of Right Thinking was first launched. In those dark days of COVID lockdown, Planet Normal was an essential weekly sanity check for those like me who thought the world had gone mad. I live on the Isle of Wight, says Ian, and I work in Portsmouth, commuting across the Solent each day on the hovercraft. During lockdown, I used the magic words, I'm exempt, so that I didn't have to wear a face mask. I used to get daggers from the other passengers, but I didn't care. We knew the masks were useless, and I found the whole thing sinister. I couldn't believe what I was seeing when the government gave away 500 billion quid, closed the schools, turned the NHS into a COVID-only service, and scandalously imprisoned thousands of its most fragile citizens in care homes. Thank you for bringing us, listeners of Planet Normal, the likes of Shanetra Gupta, Carol Sikora, Dr. John Lee, Holly the Nurse, among others. It was a time when those voices needed to be heard. In the years since, says Ian, Planet Normal has, like a good Scottish single malt, improved with age, and today we need it more than ever. As my long-suffering wife once said to me when I cut myself quite badly, please don't stop. I remain a devoted fan. Cheers, from Ian. Great to meet you, Ian.
It was a joy to meet him, although I don't think I'm going to be able to be podcasting without thinking of lovely Ian in his tub with his glass of whiskey.
With you and me either side of him.
With me, with us.
You'll get pushed out by two blokes.
I want to go at the end without the taps. Fancy the end without the taps. Now, we have had several hundred messages on co-pilot Pearson's legal action against the police. Joe says, well done, Alison, for taking the legal action. The situation has become ridiculous. Police strongly pursue non-crime incidents but can't spend time to investigate thefts, assaults and auto crime. As a retired police officer, I am ashamed at what the police service has become. I blame senior officers who try to please politicians above enforcing the law without fear or favour. And Nicholas, in the same theme, I spent 33 years as a police officer, says Nicholas, and I no longer recognise the police force I knew. Hate crimes are an absurd waste of police time when our streets are so unsafe. They should be abandoned immediately. It's not the officers on the ground who are to blame. They just follow orders. It's the politicians who set the agenda and who promote their woke appointees to chief officer posts. These are the people running the show, and they need to be held to account. It's the ACPO ranks that are driving this stuff, and that's what needs changing. Trump has the right approach. Sack those at the top and watch it all change. I fully support Alison in this. Our freedoms are too hard won and important to allow this type of intimidation to succeed. I cannot believe what is happening in this country on so many fronts. And Theresa, high-profile journalists like you need to stand up to this tyranny. I thought the establishment might have learned their lessons when Alison bravely held them to account after doorstepping her on Remembrance Sunday. Unfortunately, they seem to have got worse, questioning children and grandmothers. Good luck and keep fighting, girl. We need you more than ever. Power to the people. Yes, Theresa, fantastic. Remember who said they used to say that, Liam?
Wolfie on Citizen Smith. Or as his girlfriend's mum used to call him, Foxy.
Remember his beret? Perhaps I'll get a beret for my case against Essex police.
In Tooting. Tooting's poshed up since then, though, in South London. This is from Dan, a 60-something army man, self-confessed. This is the Planet Normal informal dating service. All rights reserved. Don't blame us. I'm happy to be matched with a Planet Normal supporting lady, says Dan, who lives in the south or southwest of England. You can tell them Dan, the 60-something ex-army officer, is open to being contacted, and share my email address. Crikey. Congrats on your brilliant interview last week with Alex Phillips. We need more brave ladies like you two to speak out. I hope neither of you get a visit from the Stasi. Best wishes as always. And after Dan the Army Man, Alison, finally Larry Limerick, a new challenger to Bob the Bard. All these incredible Planet Normal wordsmiths we have, Alison, putting ourselves to shame. And Larry's come up with a humour. Dear Rocket of Right Thinking, your latest podcast inspired me. There was a bearded man called J.D. who confronted taboos we all see. He was much reviled by greying Europhiles, but reached many hearts on TV. There was a young woman called Phillips, of course that's Alex Phillips from last week, whose courage had no limits. She spoke for reform, but PR is the norm. So uniting, says Larry, is a prerequisite. Now, of course, clunky end there, because I think Larry speaks for a lot of people who listen to Planet Normal, a lot of people across the country. They are foreshadowing a situation where the Tories and Reform go to the next election at daggers drawn, trying to fight each other, split the centre-right of British politics, so allowing Labour to win again. It's certainly a danger for many people, isn't it, Alison?
Yes, well, you know my feeling. I think they'll be sort of blow dragon breath at each other, and then they'll, unless Reform can establish a really commanding lead, they're going to have to come to some kind of pact, I think. But I'm looking out for the first defections, Liam. I'm wondering when that's going to happen. I think Robert Jenrick is being very, very prominent and out-reforming Reform. I don't know whether that means he's there waiting in case Kemi falls off a perch, ready to jump ship. I think we might well see, not now, but, you know, in the coming couple of years, Suella Braverman certainly on defection watch as well.
Following her husband to Reform, I personally think that at the next election, Reform will have from 5 MPs now at least 15, possibly 20 MPs when it comes to by-elections and defections. And on that bombshell, that's it from Planet Normal for another week. As we leave our sanctuary of sweet reason, our flying refuge of reason views, email of the week, it is our turn. Look, we have to get into that warm hot bath with Ian. We just have to. Ian,
bubbles?
It was great to meet you. Matey's a bottle of fun. You put me in the bath. I'm loved by everyone. I'm always good for a laugh. Clean fun, clean kids, and a clean co-pilot, as they said on the advert from the 80s almost. Ian, send us your postal address. Email us at planetnormal@telegraph.co.uk and we will send you that mug.
And Planet Normal listeners, look out for the co-pilot's new picture. How do you describe it? Your little...
Oh, my thumbnail.
Your thumbnail.
That's if they're WhatsApping me, but it's kind of on my Twitter.
Yeah.
As well.
Looking like an upmarket Bob Monkhouse.
Nothing wrong with Bob Monkhouse.
Very gay.
They said I couldn't be a comedian. But they're not laughing now. No, they're not, Bob. That's the point.
I miss Bob Monkhouse.
Yeah, it's very good. The golden shot. Yeah, a bit of family fortunes, our survey said.
Those were in the days when the comedians were still allowed to vote Conservative. My God, that's another century, isn't it?
Yeah, before JD and after JD. And I'm not talking JD Vance, I'm talking Jim Davison. There you go.
Yes, absolutely. They were all Conservative. Brucey, Tarbuck, weren't they?
And as we speed away from our beloved Planet Normal and the mad Kenny Everett at the Tory Party conference, do you remember that? God, that's a long time ago. Brotherly love. And as we speed away from our beloved Planet Normal and the madness of Planet Earth comes back into view, stay safe and in touch with us and with each other. Until next week, it's goodbye from me.
And it's goodbye from him.